what I'm going to do first is hand over to Al. He's going to kick the session off, and then we'll catch up with Paul a bit later on.
Thanks, Mel. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to share a few thoughts. I am covering the topic. I hope many of the points will come across as common sense, but I think often when we think about the risks within schools, common sense is actually the key bits we really need to reflect on. So yes, as Mel said, I'm Al Kingsley. I am chair of 2 multi-academy trusts, as well as being Group MD at NetSport, and any opportunity to share an emoji, I like to drop into a presentation. So that's me, and I try to share all sorts of topics around EdTech and digital strategy. I think the most important stat really is just recognizing that cyber attacks, and we might come on to talk about what we mean by that because it covers a multitude of aspects, really surprisingly does plague the education sector like it does across other industries. And in recent years, we're talking, certainly in the US, of thousands of schools publicly disclosing cyber incidents that have impacted on their operations. So really, it's, ultimately cybersecurity is about protecting the devices we all use and the services we access online. And in the recent crisis, more than ever, when it comes to the pandemic, we also need to be thinking about both home and work. And there's a headline figure there about preventing unauthorized access to the vast amounts of information we store online. Of course, the methods of how people might access that information or get access to it are far broader. And so some of the points I just wanted to share was really just highlighting here, as you can see on the stats here, percentage of organizations across schools that have identified breaches or attacks in the last 12 months. And you can see the stats there are significantly higher than one might expect. And I'd also probably go as far as to say there are many more that happen that don't get reported or logs, or perhaps regrettably, some people never know have actually happened. So going through at my kind of high level, the first thing is who are behind these attacks. And I'm sure Paul might allude in a bit more detail, but I think we can break it down into kind of, in an education setting, 5 kind of categories. So we might start off with the obvious, that the online criminals who are good at, identifying what can be monetized, what they're looking to access so they can steal it and sell sensitive data, or holding people to ransom. And that ransomware strand, of course, is a really prevalent one. And then we've got hackers, individuals with different degrees of expertise, often acting in an untargeted way. Sometimes it's just a challenge, sometimes it's to test their own skills, or simply to cause disruption. And then we've got malicious insiders. So that's users who have their own access to certain parts of organizational data that potentially are accessing other data within the organization that they really shouldn't be. In the corporate world, we might be worrying about that in terms of corporate espionage and sharing with competitions and competitors. But in the education space, it's all about who has a need and an appropriate need to have access to data. Number 4, I suppose, is the category we might all fall into at sometimes, which is just honest mistakes. Sometimes with the best intentions, we make mistakes and we email content or information out that we really shouldn't have done. And because we're talking education, the last category I think appropriate on that list would be students. Some students enjoy the challenge of putting their own cyber skills to the test, or want to access things simply because they're not supposed to. So I've tried to break down some of the high-level recommendations and areas for schools to think about. Excuse me, and I'm sure Paul will go into a bit more of the techie meat behind some of these in his presentation. So top of the list, and I guess no shocks here, what's your password? And for schools, although again, as I said at the beginning, lots of these will be about stating the obvious, actually the key is about reinforcing and reminding about the obvious and most likely areas where there will be a hack or access to your systems. So number 1 is looking at passwords, making sure that all staff have different passwords for different accounts and services, if that's possible, making sure they're unique. If you have to write passwords down, store them somewhere securely. If you're like me, and by the time you finish typing in a new password, you've forgotten what you did, consider using things like password managers, or having the IT team manage those things. Big ones are things like multi-factor authentication on sensitive accounts, so you get that second check before someone has access to it. It's a challenge in schools because we typically think, when we think of multi-factor authentication, we think of a text message to our smartphone. That's not the only mechanism. There are plenty of security authenticator apps that you can use as well. So in the classroom setting, where appropriate, that can be used. certainly for the most sensitive accounts, and also about always locking your account when you step away. And of course, when we're talking about this security, we're kind of thinking here about security, we're thinking safeguarding, and in many cases it overlaps to GDPR, data protection. So that idea about not walking away from a machine is pretty fundamental. Make sure you lock it when you walk away in a school setting, particularly teacher, front of the class, leaves the classroom. We don't want other people accessing the information. And then I was looking just at what the best practice guidance was in terms of your passwords. And for many of us, if I read out this list, you might have to go back this afternoon and do a fresh change. But the recommendations are always things like, don't use a partner's name, child's name, pet's name, place of birth, your favorite holiday, and try and do things that are unrelated to you, and use that variation of characters rather than purely textual. The next topic, let's go phishing. That's one of the most common approaches. A typical phishing attack is where a scammer sends you a fake email out, typically to thousands of people, and they'll try and steal your details when you fill in that email, the form you're sent to, assuming that it's actually something else. And a really good example of that, although I won't mention particular brand names, is there's been a recent incident where there have been both hacks to, but also phishing for school payment systems, where parents have thought they're logging in to top up school student funds for their meals, but actually have been phished and sent somewhere else. So if you get an email, you're not convinced about it, I think most people involved in any form of cybersecurity data protection across a school or any organization would say, apply that golden rule. If in doubt, call it out. If you're not sure, flag it. And that's a really, really important one. And the things that normally are tagged to go look for, and this is one where I appreciate pressure on schools, particularly on teachers at the moment. Sometimes that means that things slip through. We're quicker to try and get things done than we perhaps should do. Looking for things like poor quality images or logos, looking for the obvious spelling mistakes, grammatical errors. Does it address you by name, or is it simply a dear friend or dear sir? Is it asking you to act urgently? Often a sense of urgency is hoping that people won't go through the same rational checks. Does it refer to a previous message you don't remember seeing, and so on? So again, reminding staff repeatedly, and of course this applies to students, and actually good practice, I would argue, to parents as well, about what the school will and won't send to them and what to look for to be able to validate it's valid, to try and avoid those phishing attacks. Obviously for our students and staff, we're worried about them accessing those phishing attacks, and by doing so creating a vulnerability to the data they have access to. The next one, one that actually became very popular as a conversation point during the onset of GDPR, was this refresh and reminder about USBs, to plug in or not to plug in. That is the question. And of course, it's been very popular for teachers to use a USB device to carry resources from home into the classroom. But equally, that device can be dropped, lost in the car park, and could contain student data and other bits and pieces, or ultimately could have something on it that would compromise the school network. So there's kind of lots of different considerations here, but the most important ones is to always make sure your USB is password protected. Ideally, it's encrypted, so it can't be accessed if the device is stolen. And also check on the device that there aren't auto-run programs, and make sure that's switched off, so that nothing that's potentially going to be a vulnerability to the school network or your device is going to auto-run as soon as it's plugged into your machine. But where possible, nowadays, store school data on the cloud, access it from any point. So ultimately try and minimize the use of USBs, and certainly have that focus on schools making sure they're encrypted devices to a certain standard. I put on home sweet home because often when we think about schools, and I'll cover a few, we're very policy focused. So we have all sorts of policies when it comes to protection of data or an online activity. And suddenly we're having to just broaden that from guidance to recognize that many of our students might be working from home. Actually, we saw back in April, May, many of our staff were too. So it's about making sure if we're using home devices, we're providing guidance on the same risks. So using up-to-date antivirus software on the devices, making sure you download system software updates as soon as possible, ensure all the devices have passwords, access controls, changing default passwords, including things like home Wi-Fi, making sure that it's secure, and again, switching on that multi-factor authentication. When you're using staff devices at home, of course, what we hope is they're being centrally managed, and that security is being put as paramount, and they'll be reporting against that. It now gets onto some of the things just as a reminder to think about as part of that issue, particularly if you're a member of staff with a laptop and you're working from home. Firstly, again, that reminder, never ignore software updates that contain patches to keep devices secure. Always lock devices. Only don't download apps and software from official app stores. Don't share account credentials with anybody else. Again, I'm stating the obvious, but when we're under pressure and somebody just quickly needs to log in so they can send a job off to one of the multifunction printers, you have to remember you're also giving them access to much more. Don't be afraid to challenge policies or processes that make it difficult. And the most important one, and this isn't technical and it's not specific cyber, is about creating a culture of questioning and challenge when it comes to the steps we take to keep our devices and our access secure. Student risks. Again, lots of these things overlap, but when we're talking about how do we talk about some of these topics to mitigate, when it comes to children, we're kind of following this strand of cybersecurity, and alongside that comes the risk from a safeguarding perspective. So children, just like staff, are always at risk of the same threats, but children don't always have the same skills to actually identify where those risks are or be as critical. PureSight ran a survey and identified that 95% of US children aged between 12 and 17 have access to the internet. Not a particular surprise to me, but it was when it was the fact that 1 in 5 reported being targeted by what they would define as sexual predators. And from a parental point of view, 40% of teenagers admit to seeing things online that their parents wouldn't approve of. Now, when we start looking at that kind of content, of course, we're not specifically talking about cyber risks in its entirety. But what we are saying is that children, by the nature of their confidence and freedom to use online technology, are at greater risk of online scams, phishing campaigns, direct hacks, and things that go around that. And again, they lack that experience to identify the scams, as many of us do as adults in our daily lives. So we need to recognize that we have to put some of those steps and protections in place for them. I would always argue when it comes to safety, online safety as well as physical safety, KICSI, keeping children safe in education, and the prevent duty that came along that are two key documents that all schools will be aware of. All trustees, governors should be aware and challenging on that, and staff certainly will read that every year. But one of the criteria within KICSI, an obligation on all schools in our duty to keep our young people safe online, is that we should have appropriate filters and monitoring systems in place. That's part of our ability to protect our young people. And alongside that monitoring, we should have, ideally, all of our ISPs will provide some form of filtering, so protecting access to those sites that have been deemed highest risk. And that's things like COP sites where they're recognised, identified to have content that would be harmful. But governors and proprietors need to also consider whether we're using it appropriately. So we need to think and say, given the changes we're using in terms of digital access, how is that filtering being used? And actually, just as importantly, it's not just is there filtering, but are we taking the right steps to monitor it and change and model our behaviour based on the information that is provided? Things to do. It's one of the things that I certainly like to talk quite a lot about and almost negate some of the other things in an ideal world. So in an ideal world, the key building block for me is digital citizenship, teaching both our students and staff the practical ways to keep safe. You know, a digital citizen, a person who has the knowledge and skills to effectively use digital technologies, communicate effectively and keep safe. So we should always be thinking of KICSI and prevent duty. So we should be thinking as part of our cyber security, as well as protecting our core data and services, thinking about firewalls, VPNs, privacy apps for our students at home, parental controls. One of the most powerful monitoring tools when it comes to digital security for children at home is parents' eyes and ears, frankly. That's a key one. And also looking at that content filtering. And if we think about content filtering, there's just an example. Hopefully there's not too many words in there that cause concern. But typically content filtering that applies and runs in schools is focused about whether we think prevent duty, which is preventing radicalization, whether it's about bullying, homophobia, self-harm, suicide, all those kind of aspects get picked up. But alongside that, we can also tie that into considerations when it comes to other strands of cyber risks, whether it's about children sharing information that they shouldn't be, putting themselves at risk, whether it's questions being asked like what's your age, your sex, your location, topics that we can identify. So again, schools should build that as part of their cyber model, shall we say. The important thing is there's an awful lot of information generated and there's a risk that information in isolation is inappropriately considered or simply dismissed. And my argument is, and something that certainly is an ethos we've built technology around, is about context is key. So actually it's the sum of lots of information. Who is the child? If they trigger a particular keyword or a concern online that might place them at risk, the questions are, who are they? What time of day was it? Were they in a supervised location or outside of a supervised location? What was the website? Have they searched or engaged on similar terms before? And it's the sum of those parts that identify where there is a risk. But we also need to make sure, built in around that, that we're providing other controls. Some of our controls might be things like allowing our students to report a concern, identifying mechanisms that they can actually share those concerns back to the school. Now, we typically would think of that within the safeguarding context, but if we widen the wrapper, it's exactly the same context in terms of, I think someone's trying to access my account, someone's kind of trying to get hold of my details. And we know some of those risks overlap, where actually when it comes to machines being compromised for ransomware, often that's also linked to sharing personal or compromising information about the individual. So tying those two together and recognizing that actually many of the policies that we have within our schools, whether it's our acceptable use policy, our data protection policy, our data retention policy, our eSafety policy, for some schools our home learning policy, all of those, while we're talking about the appropriateness and the appropriate use of technology, have an opportunity to also build in a similar message about being aware of the risks and the measures we're taking to mitigate those. And part of that will be through education and knowledge, and part of that will be through systems and support, whether internal or from external parties, to make sure that the school is taking all the appropriate steps. Moving at a swift pace, schools are full of technology. It's growing, never more than now, and a need for flexible and mobile technology. I'd always argue it's important we start with, it's always best to know what we've got before we start looking at the measures to protect things. So having the right tools in place to identify all of the IT hardware you have across your school estate, monitoring what software's on the schools. And that ties in really relevantly, I think, in the last 6 months, when we moved to a position of lockdown. Many educators, for the absolute best intention, went out and looked at different online apps and services they could use to deliver teaching and learning. But at the same time, that creates a greater risk if we're doing that without considering things like GDPR. Have we done a data protection impact assessment for that product? Do we know what the risk is? What data is being shared? What about that third party? If they're hosting our data, are they secure? So looking about things like their cyber essentials status, for example, and that might be something that Paul can touch and build on. But we're looking not just at what we use, but we're having to look at the larger ecosystem of those we rely on to deliver our educational services. So recognizing that, one of the strands, again, it links back to our GDPR conversations a couple of years ago, but ties in now, is avoiding storing key data and content on local devices, making sure it's on network cloud services so that individual devices don't have the same level of risk in terms of data that can be captured from them. And I always put it top of my list, which is, I think, doesn't really matter what kind of conversation we're having, whether we're talking pure safeguarding, where we're talking about cybersecurity. Lots of these strands come back to, we need to educate and advise our students as well as our staff about the risks and provide them with the tools to be effective in critiquing and validating when they receive an email or are directed to a website, what they need to look for, what steps they need to take, and have the confidence that if in doubt, they call it out. Now that's a really fast-paced whiz through the high-level bits. I'm conscious that Paul will be talking in a bit more technical detail on some of those strands. I just wanted to share at the end, I did produce as a co-author with Mark Anderson a digital strategy guide, which includes sections on data security, safeguarding, and other strands. So I hope that will also be potentially a useful resource for you. And I think on that point, back to you, Melanie.
That was great. Thanks, Al. We ran a quick poll of attendees asking what their understanding of the term digital citizenship was. 100% of them said a person who has the knowledge and skills to effectively use digital technologies. So well done.